Hi, everybody, and welcome to yet another edition of the Southern Fried Podcast. I'm Rex Nelson, senior editor of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. This podcast is a Democrat Gazette production, and we thank you for being a part of it. Longtime friend as a guest today, Judge Robert L. Brown. Bob Brown is a retired justice from the Arkansas Supreme Court and has just a wonderful book that I wrote a column about a few months ago called All Rise, How Race, Religion, and Politics Shaped My Career on the Arkansas Supreme Court. I mean, if you're an Arkansas history nerd, which I am, if you're a political nerd, which I am, you will love this book, because I know I did. Judge Brown, thanks for joining us today.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. You know that.
Yeah. You know, I only have so much room in a column, so when I wrote my column about your book, I kind of centered on the first of it, your family coming to this foreign land called Arkansas.
No question.
Because I write about the Arkansas culture a lot, and you painted just such a great image. My mother's from East Arkansas, and I could just picture those cotton fields there and the trucks hauling workers out to chop the cotton, and swamps on either side of Old Highway 70 between Memphis. You painted such a beautiful picture. And these upstanding Virginians, and in my mind, I was just picturing your mama squalling all the way through there, saying, "Where have they sent us?"
Well, there was some of that. She was a Virginian and from Fairfax. And
yeah.
Dad started his ministry. He was an Episcopal minister and then an Episcopal bishop here in Arkansas. But he started his ministry down in Harlingen, Texas.
In Harlingen, okay.
In the 30s, and the reason he was in Harlingen is the Episcopal Bishop of Texas thought he needed to learn humility. So I sent him to Harlingen.
Interesting.
And Mom said she almost starved there. I mean, it was the Depression right before the war. I mean, it was terrible. And it was right out of Giant.
Oh, absolutely.
Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor.
My favorite movie. Yeah. My favorite movie. And it always has been about my favorite movie. And not that this was planned or anything, but I end up. Of course, Melissa, my wife, is Mexican-American from South Texas.
Yeah,
so
there you go.
Something about
there
that.
There you go. Yeah, that's
I ended up marrying into that culture, yeah.
Well, as you can imagine, I'm really a Texan by birth and by my first 7 years. Mm-hmm. And then when they closed the schools, my senior year in high school, I went down to Austin, Texas. But when I ran for the Supreme Court here in Arkansas, I did not emphasize the fact that I'm a Texan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. I understand completely. So, again, your dad, the Episcopal Church, and that became the bishop here in Little Rock, and that's how you all got to Little Rock.
That's
when you
exactly
were young.
right.
Yeah.
It took us. We drove from Richmond to Little Rock.
Wow.
All night. I was 14, so I could take my shift if I was with an adult. And that's why the part you described, my driving into Arkansas, I was driving.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Age 14, but it was fascinating. It was a completely different culture. And we just come through Memphis, which back then without the interstates was just horrendous.
It'd take half a day to get through all the stoplights.
And my dad would get impatient. I'm not sure if I was driving with him or my mother, but when Dad got impatient, you knew it. But fascinating cultural shift. And, of course, I write in the book about how I got to Little Rock, and I was known as the son of a bishop.
Right.
Which you had to be careful how you said that.
Exactly.
And I had an accent, which I didn't realize. I'm a Virginia accent. I had no idea I had an accent, but everybody else knew. Here, there, and everywhere, and tomato, all of that.
There's a moose in the hoose. Go get him out.
So I was a bit of an oddity, no question about that.
Yeah. My father's older sister married soon after World War II. She was in the Women's Air Corps in the WAC.
Good for her.
And she married, raised in Benton, Arkansas during the Great Depression, and she ended up raising a buyer for Tallheimer's department store and lived in Richmond for many, many years. And
that was a great store.
Yeah, and she would go to Europe with him. So it was quite a life for a girl from Benton, Arkansas. Yeah.
Well, Tallheimer's and Miller and Rhodes were the two stores in Richmond.
Yeah.
But
but he was a Tallheimer's buyer and would go all over the world. So I got some Richmond roots there a little bit through that. But Arkansas is home, and it became home for you. You said you found out you had an accent. Talk a little bit about the rest of the adjustment, if you will.
Well, I came here, of course, in the 9th grade, and I'd gone to an all-boys school in Richmond and had a great, I guess I would call it a Victorian education. So although Forest Heights and Central and Hall High were great schools, those are the three schools I attended here, I was a little bit ahead initially. And I gradually regressed as my social life took hold.
There you go. There you go.
But as you know, Central High School back then, this is when I was a sophomore, I mean, it was a city.
Oh, huge.
You went there, and I mean, all sorts and conditions, except no African Americans, of course. But it was the last year of segregation, and I was here in the Jim Crow era. So I watched it all develop, the Brown decisions being implemented, and then, of course, the integration of Central. And I talk about a meeting I had my junior year when I was with Hall High School, and the Quakers came to Little Rock to kind of pray and hope to put a little bit of prayer for life into a very tense situation.
Yeah.
So I went to a meeting with a couple of the Little Rock Nine and a couple of my contemporaries. And I remember at the meeting, because I was not really well versed with how my peers in the black community lived. I had no contact with them, Jim Crow and all that. So I met with Melba Patillo and a couple of other the Little Rock Nine, and somebody had the temerity to ask Melba, "Do you feel inferior to some of the white students?" Well, Melba said, "I don't feel inferior to anybody." And I said, "Oh, yeah." I mean, she was a force, and I was impressed.
Yeah.
I was impressed with her, and I was impressed with the whole meeting. And how I got there, I think I got there because of my dad. My dad had taken a very progressive stance. I mean, he believed in obeying the law, and that meant obeying the Brown decision. So he was not in favor of voting.
Which, as you write, led to ugly calls to your house and more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. My mother had a whistle, which she would blow into the telephone.
Wow.
When people called and just were silent on the telephone, she would get their attention that way.
Yeah, just heavy breathing on the other end. Yeah.
You got it. You got it. And I read Roy Reed's book on Faubus, and frankly, I had no idea that the state police was out, following people they suspected of being too progressive and all that in Little Rock. Well, they were following us, I'm sure.
Wow.
But it was a terrible time, tense time and whatnot. Now, I say that, I really saw no ramifications of it. I went to this meeting with the Quakers, but I was playing football at Hall and very much engrossed in that culture.
At that age, we're kind of blissfully ignorant of the ways of the world, aren't we?
I knew some of my friends were involved in the chili incident at Central High School, where chili was dumped. I've forgotten who dumped chili on
I've read about it,
Yeah, but I knew some of my friends were involved in that. But otherwise, I just had no idea, no contact. I knew that Central was undefeated in football.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I would go
the great Wilson Matthews is head coach of the Tigers in those days.
That's exactly right. And we had Coach Peters, who was his...
Raymond Peters, absolutely.
And he was a great coach.
Yeah.
He was at Hall. But, Bruce Fullerton and all that, Jimmy Wood. I mean, it was a great team. But enough of that. I mean, this is the year before they really had the great team, and it continued after that, but not to the extent. But Central was going through all this, and I read some of the recollections of people today, and I'm just really surprised that, it was so hard on the African Americans, and why it wasn't more caring at Central in a way.
And then, as you alluded to, of course, that was in the fall of 57, the 58-59 school year. all of the public schools in Little Rock are closed that
Well, that's
year.
right. That's right. And the adults voted that they be closed. There was the authority.
It's just unbelievable to me now.
It really is.
Yeah.
You know, our parents voted to close the schools.
Yeah.
Basically, and it wasn't close.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the vote was overwhelming. And so here we were kind of, why in the world are you doing this? And I remember going to some meeting and being interviewed by the national press as we came out of this meeting, and they just lined us up and said, "Do you favor integration or segregation?" To each of us, and of course, most of us said integration. We wanted to go to school. So I mean, it was horrendous and a low mark for our parents, in my judgment.
Absolutely. And you wind up, you said in Austin?
Austin, Texas. Yeah, at a coeducational boarding school.
Interesting.
Very interesting. And it was really progressive, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But the Bishop of Texas was a close friend of my father.
Gotcha.
And he offered me a free ride to St. Stephen's in Austin, Texas, which is a great school. And a friend of mine, Howie Cockrell, went with me, and we were the refugees. That's what they called us.
The Arkansas refugees.
And some people, I didn't realize this at the time, but some of the students there thought that we were coming to St. Stephen's to avoid integration in Little Rock. And that was strange.
Yeah, it had to be
a great education. And Austin, Texas was kind of like Little Rock back then. And
you know, there were obviously I'm too young. I wasn't born until '59, but my parents would tell stories. As you know, there were Little Rock kids who farmed out with friends and relatives, literally all over the country in your case, but certainly all over the state. My parents told of families in my hometown of Arkadelphia, a number of them, who took in Little Rock kids that entire school year.
I know Malin Maris went down there. I'm not sure if Frank Lyon did, but there were 3 or 4 people from Little Rock that we knew. And of course, my wife is from Fordyce.
Right.
So that was right down the road. So she would come to Arkadelphia and date these Little Rock people.
That were there in school. Right.
Yeah, they're in school.
Because of the 2 universities there, it had a reputation of having a good public school district.
No question. No question.
And a lot came there, I know, that year.
I think Malin even played basketball there. So
and it was a Badger for a year. Good for him. Now you end up at Sewanee for college.
Sewanee.
Yeah,
I did. All male Episcopal school, and it's like being in the Army. I mean, you're up there on a mountain and whatnot.
What a beautiful campus, though.
Beautiful campus, and I loved it. Made some really close friends who I still have, and learned English literature. That's what I studied. And I eventually went to Columbia on a scholarship to pursue English literature. And I laughingly tell people my master's thesis at Columbia was The Sweetness of the Pain, the Female Symbol in the Poetry of John Keats.
Wow.
Now, that really prepared me for the Supreme Court and for prosecuting. I want you to know. Political campaign. But that was it. So I did literature for a long time, and then decided to I'd done some political work when I was in law school with Rockefeller first against Marion Crank, and then for Dale Bumpers against Rockefeller.
Back up just a little bit. How did you get back home to Arkansas?
During the summers when I was in law school, I decided to go to law school after Columbia.
Right.
And decided to go to UVA, which is having troubles today, even as we speak.
Oh, so sad.
And our mutual friend Raymond Abramson also went to UVA.
Right.
But anyway, I went to UVA. I had some family who had gone there and some old friends from Richmond. So, I mean, it was a good place to go. But I went to UVA and studied the law. And during the summers, I would come home and clerk in Little Rock for a law firm, Chowney, Mitchell, Hamilton, and Burr. And during those summers, Brownie Ledbetter, who was a
old friend,
bomb thrower,
absolutely,
would call me up and tell me what I needed to do. And she said, you need to go out and campaign for Winthrop Rockefeller, who really changed Arkansas, as you well know. He was the progressive who had the vision to at least suggest and write down things that he wanted to do. The problem is he had a Democratic General Assembly, and it took a Dale Bumpers to come in and pass his vision, free textbooks, free kindergarten, more money for the med center, blacks in government, reorganization, all of that. Dale Bumpers passed, but it was Rockefeller's vision.
Absolutely. I have always, as you know, I've written about it extensively, have always said that in my mind, Rockefeller was the most important person in the 20th century to Arkansas. People say not Bill Clinton, and just what you said. I said it took a Rockefeller to make a Bumpers and then a David Pryor and then a Bill Clinton possible.
Well, that's exactly
because it
right.
forced the Democratic Party to change itself after 2 consecutive defeats by the old guard, Justice Jim Johnson and Marion Crank.
That's exactly right. And he was a visionary. I mean, he had some defects. We all have defects, but he was a visionary. And I still admire the work he did. John Kirk, I think it is.
We had John on this podcast, actually,
right?
a few months ago, yeah.
Well, he's come out.
Marvelous book. I don't know if you've read it or not.
Haven't read it.
I can highly recommend it.
All right, well, I'm going to buy it. I went to the Political Animals Club where he made a presentation, and I'm waiting. I'm going to buy that book, and I'm waiting on the second book.
He's working on all the Arkansas years now. I don't know how long it'll take.
Well,
but,
tit for tat, he came to a book signing of mine last night. So.
Gotcha. Good. Well,
he's a great guy.
Just like I can highly recommend All Rise, I can highly recommend John Kirk's biography of the early Rockefeller years.
Well, it took a Brit to come over and tell us about civil rights.
It really did. He is the expert on the civil rights era in Arkansas.
And he studied it. He has studied it.
He really has.
Yeah.
We'll be back with more of the Southern Fried Podcast, but first, this break. Hi, Rex Nelson here. Thanks for listening so far. A lot of the topics we cover here on the Southern Fried Podcast and many more can be found on the pages of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. If you'd like to support this great newspaper's commitment to bringing you the latest in Arkansas news, sports, and entertainment, consider subscribing to the Democrat-Gazette today. With your subscription, you'll get a digital edition of the newspaper every morning, along with the latest news and updates delivered to you on an iPad, provided at no extra cost. For just $34 a month, you'll get the same award-winning journalism you've come to expect from the Democrat-Gazette, including my 3 weekly columns, plus exclusive photo galleries, videos, articles, and digital extras, all in the palm of your hand. To sign up today, call 1-800-482-1121 or visit us online at arkansasonline.com/subscribe. Welcome back to the Southern Fried Podcast, a production of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. So you start getting into politics and talk about some of the people for whom you worked and how that eventually led to the Supreme Court, and we'll get to the Supreme Court later, but I want to follow this path.
I first prosecuted with Jim Tucker. I was with a good law firm, a defense law firm, and I decided I wanted something more exciting. And Jim was 27 and I was 29. We were too young to be prosecuting, but he called me up and said, I need another prosecutor because we got this backlog of criminal cases, all these people in the county jail, and we need people to come over and try the cases. So I did that for a year and a half, and then Jim wanted to run for Attorney General, and I helped him in that campaign. But I didn't want to go to the Attorney General's office.
You did not want to be an attorney in the Attorney General's office.
I did not want to do that. So the Wunderkind in Little Rock and in Arkansas was Dale Bumpers. So I knew Tom McCrae, and I called up McCrae, and he said, yeah, we'd love to have you come over and be the legal aid and write speeches. And I did that with Dale, for about 2.5 years, and went through the Fulbright campaign, which was a monumental event, as you know.
Absolutely.
Richard Arnold and Archie Schaefer and I went to Washington with Dale in 74.
1975, he would have taken office as senator, right?
You're exactly right, and I thought we were going to be the heroes up there. Well, we weren't. There were a lot of people up there who had been very friendly to the Fulbright, so we had to kind of make our way, but Dale being the personality he was, he made his way, and it was a wonderful experience. I mean, I had my committees, and Richard had his committee, and Archie did politics.
And still does.
He's wonderful. Good friend. He did a little blurb in the book.
Oh, yeah.
But then I went with Jim got elected to Wilbur Mills's seat.
Right.
And that was after the fall, after Wilbur had his Fannie Fox situation.
Fall of 76, and yeah.
And I'll tell you a good story about Wilbur. I was Jim Guy's office manager, and I said I have to go see Wilbur Mills. So I went into Wilbur Mills's office, and everybody, of course, called him Mr. Chairman. He was the most powerful man in Congress.
Absolutely.
And
I mean, Ways and Means, when he was chairman, didn't even have any subcommittees. And all of us who remember our old civic lessons know that federal tax law changes have to start over in the House. So if you wanted any change in the federal tax code, you had to go through this one guy from Kensett, Arkansas.
Amen,
That
brother.
is real power right there.
That was raw power.
Yeah.
So I go into Wilbur's office and I sit down, and he looks at me for about 5 seconds, and that seemed like an hour. And he had his glasses down on his nose, and finally he said, "Bob?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Alcoholism is a disease." And I said, "Yes, sir, I know that." He said, "I have that disease." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "I want you to know that your father," I had no idea he knew my father from Adam. He said, "Your father worked with alcoholics in Little Rock." And I said, I kind of knew that. And he said, "One of my best friends was a car dealer, and he couldn't hold a cup of coffee. I mean, the cup would just jiggle in his hand, and your dad got him into AA and this, that, and the."
Wow.
So we just had a great time talking, bonded over that. I mean, I don't think he cared much about Jim Guy, but
Yeah.
he was interested in AA and his current condition, which was...
I have to share one story with you. As you know, Arkansas is such a wonderful small state where there are 2 degrees of separation at most. Well, my late grandfather from Des Arc was the county judge in Prairie County back in the 1930s when Mr. Mills was a very young county judge of White County, adjoining counties.
Yeah.
And my grandfather would kind of mentor, apparently, Mr. Mills in the ways of county judges back then.
Now that's raw power.
Yeah. And so I go to Washington. I'm sent up there by the Arkansas Democrat in 1986. The big story is the tax reform bill of 86. And Mr. Mills, of course, long gone from Congress, but still with the K Street law firm of counsel. And I thought, well, this is an obvious story. Nobody's going to know more. He wrote most of the federal tax code than Mr. Mills. So
and memorized it.
I go see him, and when you said Mr. Chairman, he had a wooden block cutout that said Mr. Chairman.
Of course.
Still on the front of his desk. So he is cordial but not overly friendly. And then the old "who are your people" Arkansas thing, I did my name drop. And I said, "Mr. Mills, I think you knew my late grandfather." And he said, "Who was your grandfather, son?" And I said, W.J. Caskey of Des Arc. He lit up, and I'm going to quote him word for word. He said, "My God, son," said, "if it hadn't have been for the votes Will Caskey delivered me in Prairie County, I wouldn't have been elected to Congress the first time." Now, I didn't want to know the meaning of delivered necessarily. But
One for me.
yeah, exactly. Convince people to vote for me.
That's right, the old days.
Yeah. So from then on, he was a great source. Never would let me quote him by name.
Well, that was
But
wise.
it was one of those, according to somebody close to the tax negotiations type things.
Right. Well,
And
no
really,
better source.
Oh, there was not. But that is a great story because it was really interesting. So you were in Washington for how many years?
Oh, gosh, I was there for about 3.5. and
Okay.
I came back to Little Rock because Jim Guy decided he wanted to run for the Senate.
In 78, right?
And he ran against Thornton.
Prior Thornton, that great 3-way race for the Democratic nomination. Yeah.
And so I came back. I wasn't going to go back to Washington, regardless of whether Tucker won or not. I'd been there long enough, and I think it was Ed Lester.
I put in 4 years, and that was long enough for me, so I can relate. Yeah.
Ed Lester told me 2 years, and I'd been there for 3.5. Ed Lester was a lawyer who was a friend of mine. He said, "Bob, go up there, don't stay too long, come back here and run for judge." And he was kind of prescient. But anyway, I came back and decided to write articles and for about 10 years and joined Fred Harrison, and we had a 2-man partnership. Somebody asked Fred, what kind of law do you and Bob practice? I mean, we struck fear in the hearts of everybody, as you can imagine. And Fred said, well, our law practice, I could wax eloquent, but it's really grab ass.
Whatever comes across the transom, basically. Yeah,
you got it.
Yeah, if it's a paying client, we'll go with it. Yeah.
But then he went and became general counsel for the University of Arkansas, and I became of counsel with Arnold Grobine Haley and did a lot of litigation until Steele Hayes, I think, was the first to suggest I run for the Supreme Court.
And what convinced you to make that run? Why
gosh, I knew politics. Mm-hmm. And I had networks. I had the church network. I knew a lot of young lawyers. Charlotte, you know Charlotte.
Oh, that's force of nature.
Charlotte.
The judge's wife is a force of nature, yeah.
She has never met a crowd she didn't like.
She's got a great network herself around the state.
Oh, my gosh, yeah. We had a book signing last night. I mean, they were there to see me, but also to see Charlotte.
Exactly. I can picture that. Yeah.
I'll never forget down in McGee, she spent 15 minutes talking to this guy who said he wasn't going to vote for me. And Charlotte said, why aren't you going to vote for Bob Brown? And he finally said, I'm a convicted felon. That's a true story.
Yeah.
True story. So anyway, she was exuberant and a zealot, and one of the reasons, without question, that I won.
Mm-hmm. And that was what year now that you first went on the bench?
I went on the bench in 91.
91, okay. Gotcha.
And I only won, it was not decided the next day. I was behind by 30 votes, and then that afternoon I was ahead by 150 votes. And it wasn't really decided until that weekend when my opponent conceded, Judith Rogers. Mm-hmm. So I won by about 1,100 votes out of 300,000.
Yeah.
It was really close.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I've been involved in politics like I was, the little things that stick in my head. And I was going to say, she was so close because of that Jerry Russell jingle, Judge Judith Rogers for Justice. See, that's still stuck in my head. Jerry Russell was an old friend. And for those of you who didn't know, he was like a jingle master.
He was.
On radio, yeah. To get people's names to be memorable.
I'm trying to think of one of the jingles that I could recall, but I can't off the top of my head. But no,
he had famous ones way back. Remember Bob Rosamond, Pin a Rose on Me for mayor of North Little Rock?
I remember that. But he was a genius. He also was a Civil War buff.
Expert, yep.
And I went over to lecture to one of his groups about the Civil War, and I said something like Robert E. Lee was first offered the head of the overall general of the Union
Union Army, right?
And he called me over after and said, no, it wasn't the whole Union Army. It was like the Army of the Pacific or something like that. That's all right, Jerry.
I'm not going to argue on that.
I'm not going to argue that. But no, he was good. He was good.
And obviously you found the Supreme Court work to your liking through the years.
Well, I'd written an article on George Rose Smith, who you may know is just an icon.
Absolutely.
He designed all the procedures. He was on the court for longer than I was, probably close to 35 years. And he said, Bob, I did an article on him, so I knew him pretty well. He said, Bob, out of all those opinions I wrote, there were only about 6 that I consider memorable. And I said, good Lord, out of 2,000 opinions, only 6? And then I started thinking, well, I can't outdo George Rose Smith. So I picked about 9 decisions that I thought might be of interest, and that's where I went. But
which one comes to the top of the heap?
Well, the Lakeview decisions, there were about 6 of them, but they had to do with how to educate our public school students. And I'm really talking about primary and secondary school children, and how much money should be provided per school district, per pupil, and whether the education was adequate, whether students were graduating who knew how to read and write and do basic math. And the answer to that second question is no, because a lot of students go into Arkansas, Ouachita Baptist, UCA, had to take remedial classes. They really didn't know how to read and write. And I know that's the case now because everybody's on their cell phone.
Yeah.
So, it's even worse now, but we were concerned. I'm talking about we, the plaintiffs in the case, about how we can better the adequacy quotient of our public schools. So that was part of the decision.
And of course, you and I have visited about this extensively through the years, but that was such a landmark decision. I was working in the governor's office at the time, of course, as the policy and communications director for Governor Huckabee. I can remember exactly where I was when the decision came down. It was this time of year. It was November, right after the 2002 election. And we were at the governor's mansion for a luncheon event and convened an emergency meeting that afternoon. And obviously trying to comply with that decision dominated Mike Huckabee's full 4-year term, and of course ran on into the Beebe administration then. And we did what we had to do, and I have always believed that it would not have happened in the legislature unless the Supreme Court had kept that gun to the head of the Arkansas legislature, so to speak. And you did. You kept saying, come back and do it again. You don't have it right yet.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this.
It was like a school teacher almost. It keeps handing your paper back time after time.
That's what I thought I was.
Yeah.
Rapping on
That's how I explain it. But
getting a ruler on the knuckles.
We were happy. We were happy for it because, as you know, in the governor's office, we went whole hog. We were going for school districts of 1,500 minimum at one point.
I tell you this, to be brutally frank, Mike Huckabee surprised me.
Mm-hmm. I think he did a lot of people at that point.
I thought he might fight the decision.
Yeah. And demagogue it. Yeah.
And not only did he embrace it, he went much further.
Mm-hmm.
He had minimum, school district populations, quotas, that sort of thing. I mean, he was great on education. He was also great on highways. So there were a couple of things that he needs to be remembered for, but education is right there at the top. Yeah. And his school, who was his director of education? I quote him in the book, but I remember he was saying, Arkansas is a player now as far as the public schools. Because
it dominated all day, every day. I can tell you this in the governor's office of that last term, education.
Well, he got it right, and he worked on it. And, I take my hat off to him for doing that.
Well, I take my hat off to the Supreme Court for doing what needed to be done. That 1,500 number, of course, got boiled down by the legislature to 350.
That's right.
But even at 350, it was the most consolidation this state had done in decades, many decades.
In our decision, we never used the C word, consolidation, but the whole emphasis was that school districts would get together so they could amass the populations and have a better curriculum. So it was an enforced consolidation without using that term. But he did. Mike Huckabee used the term.
Well, it was a memorable ruling, and it was certainly at the top of my list of the ones that you wrote. Now, near the end of the book, and I knew we'd run out of time quickly, and we're running out of time. I'll have to have you back sometime because I'm enjoying this so much. But you've got a chapter which, as a writer, I certainly love more than just a lawyer or a writer. And not only this book, but you did a book. We were just talking about a governor called Defining Moments, Historic Decisions by Arkansas Governors from Sig McMath through Mike Huckabee. Talk a little bit about that. And people can still find that book. It was published back in 2010.
Yeah, University Press did it. Yeah, I start with Sid McMath. And Sid McMath was a war hero. He came back after World War II and ran for prosecuting attorney in Garland County, Hot Springs. And Hot Springs at that time was a controlled county, shall we say.
Yes.
McLaughlin, I think is
Leo McLaughlin, who was the dictator down there. Technically, he was the mayor of Hot Springs, but he was the dictator. Even as a former mayor, he still ran everything.
Yeah. Well, he was an autocrat, no question about it. And Sid took him on. The veterans came back, and Sid took him on. And Sid and I used to get together and laugh about that because I wrote an article about him in addition to that book. But he quoted poetry. Sid knew poetry.
Wow.
And I remember on one occasion, you're not going to believe this, he couldn't see. He was blind.
Right.
Towards the end.
Right.
And I said, Governor, let's do Invictus. And I quoted, out of the night that covers me. And he went, black as the night from pole to pole.
And took it from there?
And we did line after line.
Wow.
And he
I
was
wish you had a video of that. Yeah.
Well, I told Phil about it fairly recently, but Sid McMath was great. I guess after Sid, we had gosh, the
you would have had Francis Cherry for just 2 years, and then Orville Faubus beat him.
Orville came in and beat Francis Cherry. And
and served 6 terms, of course, 6 2-year terms.
And, he had been on the staff with Sid McMath. And I think Sid put him on the Highway Commission.
Right.
So he was really a McMath clone.
Creation, yeah.
And then Jim Johnson rattled his sabers up in northwest Arkansas, or northeast Arkansas, I guess, and
Faubus made his fateful decision in '57.
Made the pact with the devil. And he said, I think Jim Johnson told me this right before he died. He said, Orville was not a leader, but he was a follower, and he could read the the cards on the floor. And he knew that segregation was the way to go, and he followed my lead on that.
Wow.
He wasn't a segregationist at heart. He was an opportunist.
Oh, absolutely. He was a progressive from the mountains.
Yeah.
Dad was a socialist, named him after a socialist, Orville Eugene Faubus, after Eugene Debs, head of the American Socialist Movement, went to Commonwealth College for a while.
And was president of the student body.
So he was very progressive when he first came in the governor's office.
And did some progressive things. And got Rockefeller to be the development
AEDC first chairman when he was AIDC.
And what a smart move that was.
Absolutely.
And then had to run against Rockefeller, as you know. And beat him, but Rockefeller got 64% of the vote, which was a major victory for a Republican who was one of the richest men in the world, who had a few personal problems and this, that, and the other, but Rockefeller, and then came back and beat, Jim Johnson and Marion Frank. Yeah, so great history.
Well, it's a great book. Judge, I'm out of time. I really have enjoyed it. I've got to have you back, and I want to dig into this a little bit more.
We have 7 more governors to talk about.
I know. Rex. That's why we're going to have you back.
Thank you, Rex. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Judge Bob Brown, retired Justice of the Arkansas Supreme Court. His book is called All Rise, How Race, Religion, and Politics Shaped My Career on the Arkansas Supreme Court. Thank you for joining us for the Southern Fried Podcast, a production of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I'm Rex Nelson. We'll see you next time around.